Ross Terrill authored this book, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Award, as well as many other books and articles, including Mao, a Biography, and China in Our Time, just to name a few. A regular visitor to China for over 30 years, his articles have been published in the Atlantic Monthly, Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, National Geographic, and other national magazines. He has appeared on CBS News, The Today Show, and Nightline as a special commentator, and he has testified before the U.S. Congress. Several weeks ago, we invited faculty across campus, some of whom focus on China, to discuss his book. And I believe we recreated some of those discussions and some of those points today in a luncheon with Mr. Terrill. At the end of that faculty panel several weeks ago, I asked the faculty the question, after all of their discussing and disputations and insights, what book would they recommend to someone like many of us, generalists interested in China, learning more about China's role in the world? And the book that was recommended by the faculty was this book, The New Chinese Empire. For that reason and for others that should become apparent, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ross Terrill.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ringer, Corey Leonard, and you all for the welcome and the opportunity presented to us today. I'm honored that the semester book is The New Chinese Empire, and I'm most impressed with the seriousness and spirit that Brigham Young University applies to understanding the wider world and international affairs. China will impinge on us in the years to come, just as we impinge on China, and economically, militarily, culturally, in space, all over. China and America are entangled with each other. There is a story told in Beijing of 3 prisoners sitting together in a cell, and in a quiet moment the prisoner in the middle of the row of 3 says to the man on one side, "What are you in here for?" "Oh, I said, Deng Xiaoping was a great revolutionary, but Mao Zedong by then had decided that actually he was a counter-revolutionary." There was a silence, and then the man in the middle turned to his other side. "You, what are you in prison for?" "Oh, my problem was just the opposite. I said Deng Xiaoping is a nasty counter-revolutionary, but by then the Communist Party had decided that after all he was a great revolutionary." And then the prisoner first asked the question, turned it back to the man in the middle who'd been asking the question. "You yourself, what are you in this cell for?" "I'm Deng Xiaoping." So expect the unexpected sometimes in China. Deng Xiaoping, the number 2 man, did not expect Mao to turn on him. Then after Mao's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping led the shaping of the China that we see today. The Chinese leader whom President Bush will meet tomorrow and the day after tomorrow is probably more predictable than Mao or Deng. The Chinese leaders are not as daring as Mao and Deng. They're more constrained. They're more attentive to international pressures and open to international opportunities. Now, China once dominated Asia. For 2,000 years. Yet when Japan rose in the late 19th century, and Western countries, led by Britain, grabbed bits of China on the China coast, also in the 19th century, the treaty ports from Shanghai down to Hong Kong. The last Chinese dynasty, the Qing or Manchu dynasty, crumbled. It really fell in 1911 for a combination of two reasons: the Western pressure and farmers' revolts within China. And the pressure from outside came to a head when Japan attacked China in the 1930s. The ruler of China then was Chiang Kai-shek. And in the middle of World War II, his wife wrote a book called China Shall Rise Again. And in the preface to the book, her husband, General Chiang Kai-shek, wrote, quote, "For the rebirth of a people, certain factors are necessary. Of these, one is that the people should go through a period of trials and tribulations." When nationalist China, under Chiang Kai-shek, defeated Japan, with the US as its principal ally in that cause, that was a rise of China to a degree. But the Chiang Kai-shek regime fell and fled to Taiwan within 4 years, driven out by the victory of Mao's communists. And this began another rise of China. This was China rising as the junior brother of the Soviet Union. All of Asia paid attention. In the Korean War, China fought strongly against US troops, making it last 3 years. China expelled American diplomats and missionaries. At the same time, this rise of Mao's China led to opposition. In varying degrees, the Western countries opposed Communist China. Then the unexpected happened. The Soviet Union and China connection collapsed. Sino-Soviet friendship was supposed to be everlasting, but it only lasted 20 years. And the China that emerged in the 1960s from alliance with Moscow pushed a Maoist revolution for the world. Well, this coincided with cultural revolution within China, smash the old, smash the bourgeoisie, smash religion. And it was a disaster for the Chinese people. And it was the end of the idea that China would export revolution. Back on the scene came Deng Xiaoping. In the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping pointed out that the rise of China under Mao hadn't done much for the standard of living of the Chinese people. And it was understandable that the Chinese Communist government decided to make a priority of economic development and give up the idea of exporting revolution. This coincided with the opening of relations with the United States, and we have had now a 30-year period of peace in East Asia, of extraordinary economic progress, which has occurred basically because the US and China came to a certain understanding in the 70s, not perfect, but businesslike, and because Deng had replaced Mao, and the whims of one man was no longer the law of the land, and progress for the Chinese people was given a high priority. Well, the results are pretty well known to you. Within a decade, the income of farmers in China quadrupled. Recently, the rate of economic growth has been about 8% a year. Foreign trade has grown about a quarter each year, and China's become a main trading power, bidding to have a navy suitable for a trading power, economic extension to Africa, to Latin America, to the South Pacific, an enhanced military, a spirit of national pride, and a sense in China that its destiny is to be a global superpower. Overall, this new weight of China in our world is selective. China cozies up to Sudan and to Zimbabwe in Africa, for instance, because they are more or less rejected by the West. It asks nothing of these dictatorships other than that they not support independence for Taiwan. But it's extensive. China is everywhere on the map. It's modest in terms of the aid it can give, but it's very long-term in its vision, as I shall suggest in a moment. This weight of China is not because it's an advanced country, but because of its huge population, first of all. There are 90 cities in China of more than 1 million people. So the coast of China that the visitor sees is only the tip of the iceberg. You take the population of the United States, add that of Western Europe, add Russia, add Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, which is the 4th most populous country in the world, and you still haven't reached the population of this People's Republic of China. A tremendous opportunity for catch-up in economic development. A tremendous market, potentially, for the world. A tremendous importer of oil, liquefied natural gas, coal, and other resources of which at the moment it cannot get enough. Now, what are the aims of China? Before I enumerate them, let me sum up why I call it an empire. The three largest of China's 29 provinces, we don't have province boundaries marked here, but we have cities. The three largest provinces are Tibet, down here, Lhasa is the capital, Xinjiang, the Muslim area, which borders the other Muslim countries of Central Asia, and the southern part of Mongolia, which I'm sketching here, comes very close to Beijing. Now, historically, these three were separate civilizations. The Chinese were essentially limited to a point east of about here. The dynasties had their capitals either in Nanjing, Xi'an, or Beijing, or other parts of eastern China. Tibet dealt with the Chinese as one country would deal with another. As late as the 1940s, a separate Turkestan state called East Turkestan existed here. East Turkestan, because the implication was that West Turkestan is the other portion of the Turkic-speaking peoples now in the countries formerly part of the Soviet Union. In China, they're called Uyghurs, the Muslims of Xinjiang. It happened by chance and by the machinations of Joseph Stalin that the Qing dynasty boundaries, which were very extensive and included Tibet, Xinjiang, and southern Mongolia, were handed over to Mao's regime. So it's an empire in that sense. And when you go to Xinjiang, for instance, there is an atmosphere of one people in charge of another. The Chinese wear the uniforms, and Chinese is the language you have to speak if you go to college. But the language and the culture and religion of the majority, who are Muslims, is different. China is the only country of its size in the world which is all on one clock. So the time out here in Urumqi is the same as the time in Beijing. But the Muslims in their little shops out here, they defy Beijing by keeping their watches on the time of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan across the border, with whom they share language and religion. It's not an offence. You can't be arrested for having your clock on the wrong time. But it suggests the semi-colonial nature of the rule. It's unusual in today's world to have a people ruling another people in this fashion. Multicultural empires have gone, but here is one. Secondly, China claims a lot more territory than it has. You all know about its claims to Taiwan here, 100 miles off the coast. Many islands in the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, are claimed by China. The ones down here are claimed by 5 other nations in their totality. A complex situation. And China has residual claims to parts of Siberia, the eastern fringe of Russia and parts of Kazakhstan. So the empire issue is not dead for the Chinese. You may say, in Beijing's defense, it's a reverse empire issue, because they say all these areas were once ruled by the Emperor of China. And there's a tradition in Chinese political culture that if a territory was once touched by the benevolence of the Chinese Empire, then it is Chinese. Thirdly, there's an empire aspect to the People's Republic of China because it has some imperial ways. There's an orthodox doctrine, and you can't propose an alternative doctrine. It's a system from above. Under the dynasties, the officials were called mother and father officials. The emperor himself was a father to the nation. His title was Son of Heaven. He was related to the cosmos. So his mandate did not come from below any more than the mandate of the Communist Party of China comes from below. And China condescends to some of its small neighbors in this imperial fashion. It's very hard for a Vietnamese or a Korean to forget that historically their countries were occupied for centuries at a time by Chinese armies. In its foreign policy today, China's first aim is to protect the realm. We don't have this concern. We are not surrounded by such a variety of other peoples and civilizations. But China has to say, if you're dealing with Central Asia, you have to make sure there's no encouragement across the border to the Muslim part of China wanting to be separate. If you're dealing with India, you have the problem that the Dalai Lama, the leader of the Tibetans, heads a government in exile within India. The same with Mongolia. China has to carry on its foreign policy with Mongolia, where President Bush is going on Sunday to encourage a fellow democracy. You have to have an eye on the relations between Mongolia and the southern Mongolian segment, that's a province of China. So all around the peripheries of China are issues created by the proximity of other peoples or the similarity of peoples within Chinese borders to those across the border that become a foreign policy concern. Secondly, China wants to protect its economic progress. And this is where President Bush, as he talks to President Hu Jintao in China this week, carries a trump card, because the United States takes about 1/4 of China's exports. You all know this from going into department stores, the electronics, the shoes, the clothes, the photo albums. This American market for Chinese products would not be easily replaced. So China carries on a much more prudent and careful foreign policy than it used to, out of concern for this second goal. When China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, they gave in to stringent conditions laid down by the US and other countries because it was so important to their economic progress to get into the WTO. Some of you will remember that in 1996, when an election was being held in Taiwan for president, Beijing was upset that a pro-Taiwan independence candidate might win, and to send a message, they fired missile tests across the north of Taiwan, landing in the sea east of Taiwan. President Clinton sent aircraft carriers to the area, and Beijing stopped lobbing the missiles. Again, it's hard to separate that decision from the need to protect the exports to the United States and thus the 8% annual growth in GDP of the Chinese economy. A third goal of China's foreign policy is to maintain a peaceful environment. Here they have complexities of all kinds. 14 countries abut the PRC, starting up here with North Korea, Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. These three used to be part of the Soviet Union, of course, now are sovereign countries. A little bit of Afghanistan touches China here. Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Burma, Laos and Vietnam. How lucky we are just to have Canada and Mexico. That's enough. 14 countries the Chinese have to deal with. And they have, to their credit, practiced a policy of compromise with most of them. This is worth mentioning as the third point of China's foreign policy, because consider what happened before the Deng Xiaoping era. China fought on every flank from 1949 to 1979. They fought in Korea, losing perhaps 1 million dead and wounded. They fought India twice over the border. They fought the Soviet Union over the border in 1969, and the Xinjiang border with the then Soviet Union as well. There were skirmishes in the Taiwan Strait, over which suggestions of using nuclear weapons were used, both by President Eisenhower and by Mao. And then there was the tragic attack on Vietnam. Two socialist brothers, as they called themselves, as close as lips and teeth, Mao Zedong said, fought each other in 1979. But that's the end of the wars that Beijing has fought. And since then it's been compromise. They mended relations with Indonesia. Stunningly, they decided to recognize South Korea, the big enemy of North Korea. And they are practicing a certain restraint and status quo policy in a number of areas in the region. These three goals are prudent and so far so good. The last two goals are not prudent. The fourth goal of Beijing is to replace the United States as the chief influence in East Asia, as and when it becomes possible to do that. On a number of issues, China agrees with us. On some other issues it doesn't, but it doesn't resist. because it's too weak to do so. For instance, the first Gulf War, China did not veto at the UN President Bush Sr.'s actions in driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. But in Asia, China in the last 5 years has been seeking to pressure and exclude the United States. They try to drive a wedge between Japan and the US. They tell Australia to forget looking to the US and think only of China's rise in Asia. And next month there's going to be a summit meeting of East Asian powers, which for the first time does not include the United States. This is China's idea as the first step to forming an organization composed of those members who attend. The sixth goal of China's foreign policy is to get back these territories that I mentioned as the second reason for calling China an empire today, to get them back when possible. In the case of Taiwan, Beijing awaits an opportunity that will consist of some favorable evolution, favorable to them in Taiwan politics, of US fatigue at backing Taiwan, of a Japan more malleable than it is at the moment, and a better physical capacity to project troops and material this 100 miles across the Taiwan Straits onto the island. Regarding the islands down here, rich in oil and extending further south on our map to the north of Indonesia, China awaits further growth of its navy. Now we come to a crucial point. A rising power's goals are not always achieved. In modern times, authoritarian states in particular have mostly failed in the long run to achieve their goals. So what does it depend on? What do the prospects for China fulfilling all of these 5 aims depend on? I suggest it really depends on 2 points. First, will the Chinese political system endure? The next drama involving China, I think, will not be international so much as within China. Because the rapid economic progress has brought strains and contradictions. There is rural discontent. There is a new window on the world through the internet and the cell phone. Chinese are going on foreign vacations. About 150 million Chinese are hovering between village and city, getting off the land and seeking a better life in urban China. The population is dramatically aging, bringing financial and social strains that Beijing never anticipated when they decided to cut the size of the Chinese family, traditionally large, down to 3, mother, father, and 1 child. So the summation of this contradiction is travelling down one road in economics, free markets, foreign investment, and keeping to another road in politics, supervision by the Communist Party, and insistence upon a philosophic orthodoxy. I think how this contradiction is resolved will help determine whether China will really be a superpower or whether it will be caught up in distractions at home. China may gain enduring prosperity. China may remain governed by a Leninist party state. But I don't think both will occur. And I would stick my head out and say within a quarter of a century, either the economic logic or the political logic will gain the upper hand. So that's the first point that will determine whether these 5 goals are attained. The second point is equally important. Will others agree? When a new number one makes a bid, 3 things are necessary. Ambition. China has the ambition, I believe. Capacity. The capacity to be number one is not clearly beyond China. It's not in hand as of yet, but looking ahead, looking at the Navy, looking at the space program, one has to say that it could occur. The third point is the acquiescence of the other powers. And probably this is not going to be available. To take an example of acquiescence, I mentioned Japan's rise at the start. By the 1930s, Japan was bent on a big experiment in globalization, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan resented that Britain had an empire, France had an empire, the US had become a global power, but Japan, for all its modernization under American and European tutelage, did not. They wanted one. They developed a navy, and in the 1930s, the United States, Britain, and others did not signal to Japan that its bid to dominate Asia by military means would be resisted. And only in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor was Japan given the clear-cut message that the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere was not acceptable to the Western democracy. Now, there are other cases of acquiescence. The rises of great powers can have different outcomes. When the United States rose in the Western Hemisphere, eclipsing Britain, there was a smooth acceptance eventually by Britain of American paramountcy. America-China relations for 3 or 4 decades have stayed within a pretty narrow range. There have been modest swings during American election campaigns, Mr. Carter's, Mr. Reagan's, and at times when Beijing has wanted some psychic satisfactions. But there's been an essential stability since the Nixon years, which has been due, I believe, to four enduring factors. One is that Washington's power markedly eclipses Beijing's, and the Chinese political and military leaders are aware of that. A second is that China faces this tough environment that I mentioned, with multiple potent neighbours, and it has many other problems to deal with besides the United States. Thirdly, the Chinese leaders see the tasks of domestic development and preserving internal stability as absolute priorities, and this puts a limit on resisting the United States, as I have suggested. Finally, the US has seen no benefit in tangling militarily again with China after doing so in Korea and Vietnam. We now know that Chinese missiles can hit and destroy Los Angeles, as the Chinese generals like to point out, and that does change the picture. So there is this certain stability. I believe that stability would not endure if the American public, under a president of either party, became aware that China was seeking to push the US aside in East Asia. And the United States would have many cards to play. Japan would also resist that Chinese ambition. India would too. And others in East Asia, Vietnam, Australia, probably South Korea, would not want to see Chinese leadership replace American leadership. As in modern history, American interests will be seen pretty much in consensual terms, I believe, to lie in keeping China and Japan in balance, not by seeing China or Japan forge ahead of all others. There are a couple of other complications, finally, that would confront the Chinese in their most ambitious of foreign policy goals. One is that they have been a victim for quite a while, and they have presented themselves as having been bullied by the West and Japan. But if they succeeded in getting to the threshold of being number one, they would find, as the United States has found painfully, that the king of the beasts feels the bites and attacks of other beasts who don't like their inferiority. This would be a completely new experience for China. I saw the other day that they expect to have 100 million tourists a year going abroad by 2025. Well, you may remember the term ugly American when we had tourists after World War II flocking to Europe, and the Japanese later became criticized as tourists. Of course, it's all about numbers. It's not about culture. And if 100 million Chinese tourists did go abroad every year, of course, inevitably there would be talk of the ugly Chinese. So being number one has its costs, and it's a very different situation from the victim status. I also wonder if China has the philosophic equipment for world dominance, of the kind that Britain attained through its sea power, the United States through its international business, its military power, its popular culture. The Maoist sense of mission was very strong, just as the Protestant-induced Anglo-American sense of mission has been strong. But without the communist sharp edge, I think the Chinese message, Chinese nationalism, would not have a message for the world. My colleague at Harvard, Joe Nye, talks about soft power. You've probably heard about soft power. There's two kinds of soft power. One is the ability to get a standing ovation for your leader at an ASEAN summit or an APEC summit, to get membership in the UN Commission on Human Rights, to get one of your nationals on the International Court of Justice, to build a presidential mansion for some tiny republic in the South Pacific. All of this kind of soft power begins and ends with elites. China's getting quite good at that. There's another soft power which is measured by attracting students from all over the world, having your music and your movies checked out on every continent, having the doors open to your missionaries, watching your businesses become the international gold standard across the globe, having, as we do, 70% of the world's living Nobel laureates on American campuses. This kind of soft power, which the United States enjoys, comes from worldwide popular wishes. I don't think it can be replicated or replaced by Chinese soft power. I spoke of China as ambitious, but I've also said it was cautious. Each of these has some truth. There's a yin and yang relation, perhaps, to the two. The expansionist claims are clear to me, though I have colleagues much respected who disagree. But the Beijing regime, while a dictatorship, is a rational dictatorship. It can count the numbers, and it's often patient in fulfilling its goals. In a word, China's an ambitious power that seems to know it has problems, and a power that, if faced with countervailing power, will probably act prudently in its long-term strategy. I think the Beijing leaders know that a formidable array of countries, the United States, Japan, India among them, have a variety of reasons not to see China push the US aside. I've been in China for much of the last 3 months, and I must say I hear less talk in China than in the United States of China inevitably becoming number one. I think the Chinese people are aware of the difficulties in their path. But of course the Chinese government sees a tremendous opportunity to legitimate itself when it's not legitimated by being elected, by the quest for national glory and global leadership. So just as back in Chiang Kai-shek's day, China wasn't quite the sick man of Asia that it was said to be, and achieved quite a bit in the first half of the 20th century. China today may not be as overwhelmingly destined for great powerdom as those who fear it or those who from afar admire it. Thank you.